Tilea's Troubles, Part 73. The Assault on Campagrotta. Summer 2403. The brute defenders upon the city walls had watched for the 2 hours it took to drag the mighty cannon granite breaker into position. They themselves had plenty of guns, cannon barrels no less, which they employed in the way a man might wield a handgun, but they knew that the enemy was too far away for their shots to have any real effect. So they bided their time, unafraid, unaware of any reason brutes should fear the antics of little folk. The attackers, the dwarven warriors of Karak Borgo, the paladin Baron Garoy and his retinue of knights, and the Bretonnian Brabanzon mercenary company, had arrayed their lines before Granite Breaker was hauled up, ready in full force to thwart any attempted sally from the walls to capture or disable her. The dwarves themselves stood closest to the great gun, forming the assaulting army's left wing. Thane Nahak, their general, and the army standard-bearer, led the warriors. To his right were the Longbeards, commanded by Thane Thakalim, and accompanied by the runesmith Rakrik Bronzeborn. Then next in line were the Troll-slayers. On Nahak's right were the Thunderers, forming the far left flank of the army, each of them itching to move up to within range of the walls. The other missile troops stood further back, as the weapons could shoot much further than the Thunderers' handguns. A regiment of quarrellers scrutinised the walls from behind the Troll-slayers, while behind them were a pair of bolt-throwers and a pair of gunpowder pieces. Granite Breaker sat directly at the rear of Thane Nahak and his warriors, who were bracing themselves for the passage of some very large round shots over their heads. The flying machine fluttered around the army's flank, its pilot looking beyond the walls to take the measure of the city's towers. If he was to fly over the walls and above the streets, he would need to give the towers a wide berth, otherwise his machine's spinning wings would shatter. On the army's right were the Brabanzon. Captain Lodar the Wolf and his ensign Jean de la Salle led the company's largest regiment, the Spearmen, nearest to the centre of the line. Out to their right were the 2 large bodies of archers and the smaller company of veteran men-at-arms. Their small gun, which they simply called the Peace, like unto a flea compared to the dwarves' cannon imperial, had been placed directly in front of the trebuchet, all the better to perform its usual role as a guard for the larger engine. Baron Garoy and his brightly liveried band of young knights rode on the far right of the line, to a man wondering what their role in such a fight could be. It seemed to them, despite their hopes, that the enemy had no intention of leaving the walls to sally forth, a reluctance which mirrored their own stubborn reluctance to dismount and fight on foot or climb the ladders. They considered such activities to be the labours of peasants, and not at all the proper martial deeds of chevalier. Considering the fact that Razga Boulderguts had marched an army out upon his grand raid, the garrison soldiers on the walls were surprisingly numerous, with a great many lead belchers amongst them. The southernmost tower was packed with the cannon-wielding brutes, as was the next tower to the north, while the wall in between them was guarded by a small body of iron guts. The gate was held by a large company of ogres and a slaughtermaster, while several man-eaters, being the city's chief constables, occupied the tower by its side, each sporting a brace of handguns which they toted like pistols. The long, northerly stretch of the city's eastern wall was manned by an even larger company of a dozen ogres and a further half-dozen lead belchers. The garrison commander, a slaughtermaster known as Lord Wergrut, although the title Lord was an affectation, and the rest was only part of the name he himself professed, had climbed to the very top of the tallest tower in the city's eastern ward, from where he could survey not only the full extent of the eastern walls, but also the enemy force in its entirety. As the dwarves employed the crane to heft a weighty round shot to Granite Breaker's muzzle, where they could then tip it in, the slaughtermaster Wergrut looked down on the lead belchers in the corner tower and the iron guts on the wall adjacent. He decided that they were not best placed to serve in the defence of the city. The wall was where the enemy might gain ingress, which is why the iron guts were there. But the lead belchers could hold it just as well, and would have just as good a view of the enemy from the wall as from their tower. So he bellowed orders down, sending the iron guts along the street behind the wall as a reserve, ready to defend wherever the most pressure was felt, while the cannon wielders on the tower were to shift themselves over to the wall. Now, at last satisfied with the disposition of the forces at his command, he thought he might start the fight with a bang. Pausing a moment to recall the strange words of the necessary incantation, then allowing the winds of magic to infuse his bulky frame with potency, he called upon a comet to crash from the heavens. For the briefest of moments he gave himself up to elation, for he could see the comet's bulk in his mind's eye. Then, as if he had awakened suddenly from a dream, the comet was gone, snatched from reality the very moment it began to manifest, by the dwarven rune master, who employed a talisman to break the spell's power. Just as Wargrut began scouring the enemy lines to spy out who might have been responsible for the thwarting of his spell, the enemy began to move. They advanced almost as one, although out on the right the Bretonnian mercenaries struggled to match the naturally slower pace of the dwarves and came on a little faster. The fallen damsel, Perrette Lamy, attempted to throw a flurry of fireballs at the walls, but the enemy's second-in-command, a slaughtermaster like their general, managed to sap the winds she was employing, and her efforts came to naught. The ogre magician could do nothing to prevent the firing of the cannons, however, and all three muzzles, two small, one huge, were sighted upon the long northern wall. The trebuchet crew, whose first shot had merely bounced from the wall, could only look on with envy as all three round shots smashed into the stone to leave visible cracks and dents. The wall's defenders, the largest company of bulls in the garrison, peered uncertainly over the crenulations, or picked at the cracks that extended up even as far as the parapet, and, deciding that they would rather defend the fallen ruins than become buried within them, they backed off the wall to take up position behind it. They were not the only ones scrutinising the damage. Baron Garoy, riding his mighty destrier and clad in his heavy battle armour, his shield bearing the image of a white stag's head and his helm bearing antlers in his livery of gules and argent, had lifted his visor to get a better look. What he saw gave him hope that he and his knightly retinue might be contributing to the fight a lot sooner than he had thought. For if the walls came down, perhaps they could ride over the rubble to bring their lancers to bear. The dwarven crossbows launched a packet of bolts to sting the man-eaters in the tower by the gate, while the Brabanzon longbowmen's arrows merely clattered and rattled on the wall being vacated by the bulls. The dwarven thunderers could contribute nothing to this sharp-tipped hailstorm, however, for they were too busy moving forwards just to get into range of the walls. Watching from his high vantage point, Lord Wargrut saw the dwarven thunderers were preparing to fire a salvo at the walls, and so summoned an ice-shard blizzard to assail them. His second-in-command, following Wargrut's lead, also attempted to inflict them with a curse called Brain Gobbler, but he failed to contort the winds of magic sufficiently to bring the magic into being. Meanwhile, having spied the damsel Perrette, her red dress and hair marking her out very clearly amongst the dirty yellow and green liveried Brabanzon spearmen, the man-eaters in the tower near the gate decided to snipe at her. At first, both she and the men around her wondered what the zipping sound was, until one bullet pinged very loudly off the rounded helm of a soldier, and then another cut a gash through Perrette's arm. She stumbled, but the man next to her caught her before she fell. Thanking him, she laughed. When he looked at her in puzzlement, she pointed to his surcoat and apologised for the spotted stain of her own blood. He then grinned and said, "Do not worry yourself, madame, for my clothes are used to being blooded, and the stain on your own dress can barely be seen." Moments later, a roaring wave of thunderous flashes ran along the wall-top as the lead belchers gave fire. 7 dwarven thunderers fell, as well as a Brabanzon spearman. The dwarves barely flinched, however, instead gritting their teeth and continuing to prepare their pieces. The rest of the assaulting army continued their advance, with the flying machine zipping over their heads, its pilot considering where exactly he could drop his grenado. After saying "excuse me" to the fellow who'd helped her remain on her feet, Perrette held forth her hand to present her ruby ring to the walls, and with a brief word of command conjured a ball of fire to burst against the parapet holding her attackers. Not satisfied with merely singeing them, she immediately summoned another fireball to follow, and this time one of the lead belchers fell screaming from the tower, his large flask of powder exploding even before he hit the ground. The men with her gave a cheer, to which she, despite the pain from her wound, replied with a curtsy. As the sound of the cheer died, it was replaced by another, and although the choir behind the sound was rather smaller, they were no less elated. The Brabanzon's trebuchet had landed a stone on the damaged wall, and in so doing pierced the first hole to go right through it. Its crew whooped their delight, then shouted across to the dwarfs to get a move on and finish the job off. Granite Breaker was not quite ready to fire, and so one of the smaller pieces obliged. The ball hit just below where the stone had pierced, and for a moment it looked like all it had achieved was to create a second hole. But then a bulge appeared in the stone between the holes, and, moments later, and without need of further iron shot, the wall came tumbling down. The collapsing masonry poured out fore and aft of the wall, burying two of the bulls behind. There was no time to dig them out, so if they weren't already dead, they soon would be. Unsurprisingly, a great cheer went up along the line at the sight of the breached defences. Granite Breaker's chief gunner gave these events a little thought, and came to the conclusion that the wall had fallen so quickly due mostly to his own gun's contribution, but that his shot had been aimed slightly out and failed to deliver maximum force, which is why the other machine's efforts had been required for completion of the task. This did not satisfy him at all. The Cannon Imperial had already been shifted to aim at another wall, thus delaying its second firing. So now, using a two-handed mallet, he knocked out one of the 4 large iron wedges at the breach to lift its muzzle a little, and thus alter the path of the next flight. He had measured everything previously with his sight and level, involving much effort in the placing of the instruments on top of the behemoth, and the application of considerable mathematical expertise. Now, however, having gained the practical experience of witnessing a shot in action, he had felt better for the work. Besides, his dissatisfaction had turned to impatience, and he wanted to prove the Cannon Imperial's true worth. Clambering up the steps, he grabbed the pike-length linstock and reached it forwards. Then, with considerable trepidation, he lowered the burning end of the matchcord towards the line of bruised powder leading to the touch-hole. Just like the previous time, there was a delay as the powder flashed and the burn thrust its way down through the deep hole to the massive charge packed in the belly of the beast. This gave the engineer just enough time to spin about and descend 2 of the steps before the mighty boom. He hit the ground almost exactly as before, but did not attempt to climb to his feet immediately. Instead, he turned his head to get a quick look at the walls before the smoke of the blast obscured the view. A second wall was down, felled with one blast. Now he was satisfied. The cheering renewed before the previous cheer had fully died away, this time growing louder than before. The third cannon chipped at the tower, and although the bolt throwers could not perfect their aim against such a concealed foe, the crossbow dwarfs killed one of the man-eaters. What had seemed an almost impossible challenge to the attackers was now beginning to look like a distinct possibility. They could win this battle. The assaulting army was drawing near, and the defences were breached in not 1, but 2 places. The Iron Guts now raced up towards the breaches, while a second body of ogres reformed behind the ruins of the wall they had once occupied. The 2 slaughtermasters, despite knowing they needed their magic to bite, failed to conjure anything that could harm, or even just slow down the foe. The man-eaters, having spotted who was responsible for their mate's demise, blasted everything they had at the maiden Perrette, but such was their fury that it ruined their aim. The 3 companies of lead-belchers spread their efforts more widely, killing 3 Brabanzon spearmen, 2 dwarven thunderers, and damaging the flying machine. None of this was sufficient to dishearten the assaulting army, and so on it came. Damaged, but still able to fly, the dwarven flying machine now crossed over the walls, dropping its bomb as it passed, bloodying the bulls below. Turning abruptly, it came to halt atop one of the city's inner towers, where the pilot leaned and twisted all ways to assess the damage received. Perrette had just as little luck as the slaughtermasters with their own attempts to summon up magical harm, her concentration being jarred both by her wound and the cacophony of noise, what with cannons booming and walls collapsing close by. while Baron Garoy took the chance to break away from the line and make better speed towards the breaches, the attacking army shot everything it had at the walls. Granite Breaker caused the tower by the gate to collapse partially, while one of the smaller cannons wounded the slaughtermaster upon it, as well as one of the man-eaters with him, bringing down the parapet to boot. This sudden removal of the stone hiding the man-eaters gave several others an unexpected opportunity, and although the bolt-throwers both missed, the dwarven crossbows killed another of the veteran brutes. The third cannon could only shake the tower once more, while the trebuchet landed a stone upon the bulls nearby, bloodying one of them. The crew of the Brabanzon's little piece joined their fellows' efforts, yet only managed to bury their shot into the ground before the walls. The largest of the bull regiments now argued whether they should sally out or not, in the end simply standing their ground, out of an inability to decide. Behind them, Warhammer was not so hesitant, and tore down the tower stairs to run out onto the street. The enemy were getting so close to the walls that he had decided he needed to be where he could get to grips with them. While he ran, he conjured chain lightning, killing a troll slayer but failing to reach any other units. From the street, he threw a magical blizzard of ice shards up at the flying machine, once again damaging it. While one company of lead belchers now brought down 2 of the knights riding with the young baron, the other 2 companies both aimed at the dwarven thunderers, killing 9 of them. The remaining pair made a sorry sight indeed, but they did not run. Perhaps because there was so much in front to distract them, the ogres entirely failed to notice that they had left the northern wall open to the enemy's possession, and so it was that the Brabanzon brigands, a company of skirmishing archers, threw up some ladders and occupied it. While they did so, Baron Garoy led a charge across the rubble into the lead belchers, and the troll slayers charged into the bulls. The mounted knights struck hard at the brutes, killing one and wounding another seriously, which disheartened the foe so much that they turned to flee. They did not get far before lance points thrust deep into their backs to kill the rest of them. Such was their urge to have at the foe, however, that 2 knights fell in the act of simply crossing the rubble, their steeds' legs broken. The troll-slayers fought not one jot less bravely than the Bretonnian chivalry, and took down 2 of the ogres, as well as wounding a third. Moments later, however, they were all dead, beaten to a pulp or crushed underfoot by foes standing more than thrice their height. While these vicious struggles were fought, Perrette poured out every fire spell she could muster, burning the bulls at the gate, but failing to kill any of them. Between them, the dwarven quarrellers and one of the bolt-throwers killed the last of the man-eaters, leaving the slaughtermaster alone. For a moment he glared at the foe with hatred, then realised he had to decide what to do now, and fast. He was not quick enough, though, for the Brabanzon's 2 war machines hit the already badly damaged tower, shaking it visibly. Then, as one of the smaller dwarf cannons misfired, the other punched so hard that at last the tower fell. The slaughtermaster came tumbling down with it, somehow staying above the rubble to avoid any real injury. Close by, Granite Breaker punched a visible hole in the wall by the gate, but as yet nothing big enough to assault through. Campagrotta's defences were being torn to pieces. While the Iron Guts moved down the street in pursuit of the Bretonnian knights, and Wergrut's lieutenant moved to occupy one of the city's inner towers, Wergrut himself went to join the bulls defending the breach nearest to the gate. Neither slaughtermaster could conjure anything from the winds of magic to trouble the enemy, but a hail of lead belcher shot finally destroyed the dwarven flying machine, which tumbled down into the street with a crunch. The brigand archers hurried from the northern wall to occupy the corner tower, thus allowing the Brabanzon's veteran men-at-arms to clamber onto the wall using the same ladders, while Baron Garoy ordered his knights to turn about and prepare to receive the inevitable charge from the Iron Guts hurtling along the street behind. The damsel Perrette summoned another burning orb to throw at the enemy, slaying 2 of the bulls massed behind the fallen stones, just as the small Brabanzon gun felled a third. Moments later, a huge round shot from Granite Breaker caused the wall by the gate to collapse, killing another pair of ogres in the fall. The brutes' dying cries, the foul stench of burning flesh, and the sight of bent limbs reaching from the rubble, only made the rest of the bulls angrier, more determined to stand their ground. From the tower's vantage point, Wergrut's lieutenant looked down on the battered bulls below. He sensed their frustration at simply standing to receive shot after shot, both magical and mundane, being ingloriously whittled away. So he shouted, "Go on then! Go!" This was all it took for the bulls to yield to their inbred desire for a fight, and they scrambled over the rubble to charge into the Brabanzon spearmen. The fight was quick and nasty. Lodar somehow avoided facing the bull's champion, and instead cut deep into the flesh of two other bulls, while the spearmen's sergeant dodged the champion's powerful blows. Despite her injury, Perrette spun with an elegance learned from a dancing master in her youth to avoid another huge club. Had it hit, it would have crushed her entire body to a pulp. 6 spearmen died, half of them perishing from the mere impact of the hulking foes, while only 2 ogres were slain. The Brabanzon had the weight of numbers, however, and pressed on aggressively, presenting a wall of sharp, jabbing spear tips before them. When the remaining 2 bulls realised their mistake, they foolishly attempted to return to the defences. Their efforts were in vain, however, and the Brabanzon stepped over their corpses to come right up to the rubble. Wergrut summoned magical lightning to fry 3 of the brigand archers in the northern corner tower. Then the arcing lines of burning light shifted their fury to the men-at-arms approaching below, killing another 4. Up on the few still standing walls and the tower, the lead belchers were reloading and firing as fast as they could, killing several of the dwarven longbeards and warriors drawing ever closer to the breaches. Just as the knights had managed to reorder themselves, the iron guts came crashing into them to begin a bout of hacking and slashing from both sides. Thick skin, metal armour, and the protective blessing the knights had prayed for before the battle all conjoined together to prolong the fight. Here and now, Baron Garoy was learning what a real fight was like, and it was a lesson he embraced with open, mailed arms. The men-at-arms upon the nearby wall now attacked the Iron Guts' flank, some striking down from the wall itself, and although they lost 2 of their number in so doing, their intervention shifted the odds significantly. When one Iron Gut was cut down, his blood spattering all around, the remaining pair staggered backwards, looking for a way to escape. Baron Garoy laughed as he and his knights spurred their horses on to follow fast, thrusting their lance tips deep through the enemy's grey flesh and riding right over the ruins back outside the city. The most northerly quarter of the city was now overrun, but the ogre garrison was not yet beat. Wergrut moved into the ruined tower by the similarly ruined gate, while the lead belchers above moved to reposition themselves all the better for the fight yet to come. Wergrut conjured a powerful blast of wind to blow the men-at-arms from the wall in the north, but so agitated had he become that he lost hold on the winds of magic, and allowed them to dissipate before he could spin them into a new spell. Somewhat dazed, he now watched the dwarven warriors approaching hesitantly, while the Longbeards began climbing, in a similarly cautious manner, over the rubble to his left. Behind him, Perrette and the Brabanzon spearmen had already entered the city and were making their way along the street parallel to the wall. A stone from the trebuchet landed amidst the remains of the last regiment of bulls, killing another of their number, and while the rest of the allies' artillery merely chipped grey stone and bloodied grey flesh here and there, Granite Breaker's huge ball ploughed deep into the earth, whilst the score of quarrels that clattered all around Wergrut merely nicked and picked at his grizzled flesh. The brigand archers peered over the parapet of the tower they had captured, watching as their Brabanzon comrades made their way down the street. They could see also that the dwarven Longbeards were clambering across the tumbled ruins of the wall. Immediately below them, the young baron led his knights back over the ruins a 3rd time to re-enter the city, their mounts bucking and rearing at being forced yet again to traverse such precariously difficult ground. One by one, however, the brigands realised something had changed. The artillery had fallen silent. They turned to look across the field before the walls and could see the guns were still where they had been, with full complements of crewmen. They were not being troubled by attackers. They had ceased firing for some other reason. Perhaps, suggested one of the brigands, they don't want to harm the soldiers now entering the city. Or, said another, maybe they've run out of powder. The truth was that the Cannon Imperial's chief gunner had commanded a cessation in firing. There had been something about the sound of the last shot and the gun's bucking, shaking movement in so doing that concerned him. Something was not quite right. The ancient gun had done good service, and no doubt if she were to continue in like manner she could take down the last of the city's eastern defences. But he had not liked what he had seen and heard, and a torrent of thoughts were now tumbling through his mind. He was not at all a superstitious fellow, so his concerns all had a very practical bent. Had the tarnishing of the barrel over the years somehow weakened it, either its bronze fabric or the runic wards protecting it? Was the powder they were using too potent compared to the ancient powder Granite Breaker's barrel was forged to withstand? Had the journey down the iron road weakened the carriage dangerously, so that the next shot would bring ruin to both the great gun and those who tended her? He decided not to risk it, and so signalled a stop with a crossed sweep of his hands. Inside the city, Perrette and the men she was with suddenly came to a halt. Before them was a sight that sapped every ounce of will they had to advance any further, and they could clearly see the dwarven longbeards who had been climbing over the rubble ahead of them were of a like mind. The last few of the ogre bulls up ahead had fallen back from the wall, moving a little way down a street, leading away. In so doing, they had revealed the brutes further on, each and every one clutching a cannon barrel, standing ready to fire. To approach any closer, down such a narrow, stone street, would surely mean certain death. Men and dwarves halted, while the enemy watched and waited. One Longbeard scrabbled back to ascertain while the artillery had ceased its efforts, while the Brabanzon spearmen shouted up to the brigands behind to ask what had happened. Within moments, both men and dwarves realised that there would be no further barrage to blast the walls and towers beside this monstrous battery of enemy barrels. Perrette studied the brutes through narrowed eyes, knowing she had no more magic in her. Her rage had been transformed into fear, and the loss of blood from her wound was beginning to make her feel faint. The soldier by her side dropped his spear to take a hold of her instead. Up ahead, one of the brutes was smiling cruelly. With one hand raised, he crooked a finger to beckon them on, while in his mouth he held a smouldering match dangling over his pieces pan. "In the morrow!" came a cry from the dwarfs, who began to back away. "We'll try again in the morrow!" This was all the Brabanzon needed to make up their own mind, and they too left, scrambling as fast as they could over the fallen masonry and between the ragged edges of the torn walls. Before long, all other attackers had left the walls, towers and streets also, to return to the siege lines. And so there was to be a lull in the assault, at least until the guns were ready to recommence their brutal barrage. Not one man nor dwarf thought they had lost the battle, however. The city could not escape, and its garrison was without a doubt mortally wounded. But if they used the guns wisely, it could be a victory without needless slaughter amongst their own. They needed to maintain their strength if they were to take the other Campagrottan settlements, to recapture the realm of Rivola for Baron Garoy, and, if needs be, to face whatever army Boulderguts brought back with him from his grand chevauchée. Besides, as the Brabanzon declared by their fires that night, what use is plunder to a dead man? They knew they had the right tools for the job, and were happy to allow those tools to rest a while before they finished their labours.